Okay, so delighted to introduce and welcome Anna Nicinksa, hopefully I pronounced it correctly, to the LSE Health Policy seminar series. We are going to hear today a talk about Soviet communism and health with a particular focus on education. So Anna, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jean. Thank you for having me. I'm excited to present because it's been the last 6 months that I worked on this. It's a collaborative effort. There were 4 people involved in this project, but I was, the initiator and the main executor. What I want to do today is to give you a general overview. Sorry, I need, okay, now I had some problems with switching on the slides. Okay, next one. Got it, sorry. So I wanted to give you a general understanding of what we are doing in this project and why we find it relevant, novel, and important. So that's the overview of today's presentation. And I wanted to start with this picture because it's quite striking that in 2016, it's a quarter of a century after communism collapsed, you still see the border in Europe distinguishing Soviet bloc from Western Europe with respect to basic health measure, that is life expectancy and birth. And this picture and this border comes up whenever we look at health behaviors or other measures related to health, and it's quite persistent picture. Here's another example, and I have more maps on that. So we thought, okay, maybe there is something in it, and maybe it is Soviet communism that is responsible for this picture, and it posed the effect that are still long-lasting. And if that's the case, what is the mechanism responsible for this effect? Because by saying Soviet communism, you of course mean a lot of things that happened at that time. So what would be the main mechanism? And is there a main mechanism? And we hypothesized that it is possible that education was responsible for that, apart from other channels. Why we focused on education? This approach came up from the theoretical background and empirical findings showing that there is a very strong correlation between socioeconomic status and health. And it's so well known in demographic and population studies that people started to refer to this phenomenon as the gradient. So, and it's found universally all over the world that the higher the education and socioeconomic status, the better the health. Now, whether it's causal, what's the direction of the effect, it's something different, but we find this consistently throughout cultures over time. Very often the socioeconomic status defined as the individual education, occupation, income, it could be reduced to education. It seems to be responsible for the income that people have in their lives and also the occupation they choose. So according to Grossman, it also can be without much loss reduced to education. And there is also additional advantage of focusing on the education is that it is observable for the whole population, whereas other components of socioeconomic status are not always observable. So that's the theoretical and analytical reason for focusing on education. And also there is a lot of differences and systematic differences in communist and non-communist education. So there might be really a channel transmitting this Soviet communist effect on health. Now, what we know so far, and of course the literature on that is massive and numerous studies were conducted. First of all, we need to recognize the simple fact that the health effects are heterogeneous between countries exposed to communism. They are quite heterogeneous within the Soviet bloc at the beginning, and now after the transformation, the level, extent of economic development is quite different. There is a lot of variation within post-communist countries, and it translates to the heterogeneity of the health effects. But it's striking to find that in some Eastern European countries, the collapse and the end of communism resulted in the improvement of life expectancy and health. But in other countries, it was the other way around. And there is a lot of literature showing that the reduction of life expectancy after transition could be credited to individual behavior, such as alcohol consumption or poor dietary choices, but also to the healthcare system in the countries. So there is a lot of different things going simultaneously within this group of post-communist countries. And if you look at the East and West Germany, you can see that there is a lot of dynamics, and there is not a single pattern that shows this process. It was quite complex and quite dynamic. So if we talk about the communist collapse and effects of exposure to Soviet communism, there are the effects that came up from events that happened during the communism, but then there is a period of transition from Soviet communism to free market and democracies. And this particular period is also unique to the post-communist countries. And then there were things like tobacco companies that targeted women and advertised smoking that became fashionable. And we find some evidence showing that it increased lung cancer and tuberculosis among women as a result. There is a large body of literature focusing on the changes in socioeconomic status and relative income inequalities. And these deep changes translated to health status. And a lot of literature emphasizes that the instability and work-related stress that happened during transformation period is responsible for health changes in post-communist countries. And there is a very strong and well-documented evidence that the alcohol consumption that raised in Russia after the communist collapse is really responsible for the health decline that happened among men in the early 90s there. And it's an example of an institutional change, the demise of the anti-alcohol program that was present under Gorbachev reign, and withdrawing of that affected behaviors, and it in turn affected mortality rates. So this is the effect not only of the exposure to communism, but transition from communism to democratic regimes. Now, we also should know that the transition concerned not only individuals, but also the healthcare system. And it was, by definition, adapted by all the Soviet bloc countries, but mainly these characteristics considered Soviet Union. And it was focused on communicable disease control. So that was something critical to control the spread of these diseases. So vaccination, sanitary control, hygienic approach to waste disposal, and milk pasteurization. These were the actions that were undertaken. But as a whole, the whole sector was considered not as productive as heavy industries. So there was not much investment in it. And the infrastructure has been deteriorating from the 60s, and the qualifications of medical workers were not very impressive, I would say. So these are the mechanisms that started already under communism, and they continued after transformation. The inefficiencies due to heavy decentralized authority were also the reason why this healthcare system was not very strong. And then it's important to emphasize that despite the coverage with the social insurance was universal, so every citizen was allowed and entitled to consume public healthcare system, but the package of services was very limited, and there was a lot of informal payments involved. In some countries, it was really big part of the system, the unofficial informal payments, and they were a large source for health financing. So this is a picture of a health system that is completely different from what we have in capitalist countries. Now, let me take a step back and tell you a little bit more how we view the Soviet communism and what institutions, and with particular focus on education, that we find relevant for our question. So we define it as, following the dictionary, that the political economic regime is based on the collectivist planning of human needs. And in case of Soviet communism, it started with the establishment of Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. It's 1922. And then after the Second World War, the Soviet bloc of aligned countries controlled by Stalin was really a powerful group of countries. And it lasted till 1991, when the dissolution of Soviet Union took place. All institutions are public and controlled by the state. There was a lot of nationalization and dispossession going on because of the state control, collectivist planning. So private property in some countries was non-existent virtually. In others there was some, but mainly the private property was nationalized and people were dispossessed. And those who didn't share political views were persecuted. And the context of this situation and globally is that the capitalist countries were in a way in a state of war with the Soviet world. So so that's the global picture. And there were also a lot of protests within the regime that finally led to the communist collapse and transition to democracy in the 90s. If you look at the map of Europe, you see those countries that were part of the Soviet Union, those that were allied here, and the Western world. And very often we view the Soviet Union as the monolith, whereas, for example, here are Baltic countries that gained independence in 1918, and then communism was imposed on them, and they were incorporated into the Soviet Union. So we need to remember that the Soviet bloc is quite heterogeneous, even from the start, from the beginning of its existence. And also the length and the history of entering and exiting the Soviet communism is quite complex. And here are the main countries that we analyzed in our empirical analysis, and you see a lot of heterogeneity here. So there are countries that were exposed for a relatively small period of time to Soviet communism, whereas other countries were there from the beginning and remained till the final dissolution of Soviet Union. So this heterogeneity gives us the analytical opportunities, but it also shows that despite the similarities, within Soviet Union, within the Soviet bloc, differences. And and this is something that I wanted to stress because it is relevant for our analysis. So the pre-existing institutions are relevant. And for example, in the lands of the former Prussia, education was quite well established. The same in Habsburg and Paris, where in the formerly Russian lands, education was really scarce in rural areas, and there were certain areas, mainly urban, where it was quite developed. But in general, the compulsory education was non-existent, and in other lands it operated even before. And this concerns also other public institutions, right? As I mentioned before, there are countries that can be treated as those on which the Soviet Union was imposed externally, and there are countries that chose to be communist, right? And there are some also religious differences, because if you look at the Soviet bloc, you have different Christian and also other rites. So, and this can be relevant for individual choices, these religion differences, and to approach to particular institutions. So, when the transformation took place, it is not surprising that it happened at different pace, and it started in different moments in different countries. And it was characterized in most of the countries by introduction of a novel democratic and market institutions, like, for example, in Russian lands. Whereas in the Prussian or Habsburg lands, the free market existed before. The processes of privatization or reprivatization, there is a lot of heterogeneity, and different patterns were chosen, different solutions in different countries took place. In most of the countries, however, the structural unemployment took place, so the misfit between people's qualifications and the needs of new developing markets. And the overall macroeconomic volatility was really strong in most of those countries, but again, heterogeneous, and many of them experience hyperinflation and so forth. Again, different countries approach differently the question how to treat former elites of the communist reign. But in general, the deterioration of public goods provision happened throughout all of the Soviet bloc. So this is just example. It's not the complete list of heterogeneity and differences, but I think it's important to keep that in mind. And within this complex picture, there is something that is really quite surprisingly unique and similar among the countries. Of course, I'm not saying identical, but the education imposed by the Soviet and the Communist Party is really strong, and this picture is quite consistent for all the countries from what I read. So first of all, the main role of school, of Soviet school, is a development of the new Soviet man and preparing him to be a suitable worker in the planned economy. So it is ideological, but also pragmatical project. So we want this man to be a true Soviet man with certain values, but at the same time, we need this person to be prepared for further work in Soviet economies. And we find a lot of Marxist-Leninist ideological contents in the curriculum, especially during Stalinist period. And those positive values of socialism, communism, and so forth, were very often accompanied with negative values. So against religion, against individualism, against family, and foremost against capitalism, right? So that was very often included directly in the curriculum, the open critique of capitalistic relations and the appreciation of communist ways of doing things, of folklore culture, and so forth and so forth. What's important to note is that there is no alternative to free public schooling with this uniform curriculum. So education under communism couldn't be, well, in some rare cases, it was possible, but only if you decided, for example, to become a priest, then you could choose a religious school. But it was very limited access to those alternatives, and there were no private schooling, no religious schooling at first level, primary level. So, so this is really something that is universal for the Soviet bloc. And the system of education in Eastern Europe differed with respect to these features to what we have in the Western countries. So in the Western countries, there is no state control over curricula to the extent that we experience in Soviet Union and Soviet bloc. The length of the school day, this is actually something that is still distinguishing Western from Eastern Europe. Kids stay much less. Kids in Eastern Europe spend much less time in schools than their pupils in Western Europe, but they have much more homework load. So the school is less responsible for this. For the teaching, the kids are responsible to do a lot of work at home. And the extracurricular activities are quite popular in Soviet bloc, but there are many aimed at instilling those values and not necessarily educating, but bringing and transmitting ideological values. And the approach to physical education is very different in Western and Eastern Europe. In the Soviet bloc, there was a cult of physical strength, and there were more teaching hours spent on physical education than in the Western Europe, and there was access to facilities and to equipment that allowed children to engage more in physical education. And we thought this feature might be relevant in understanding the differences in health as well. So I have some examples from Poland showing what is what communism made to the education system, but I wanted to show you this video because it really nicely summarizes and illustrates the main sorry, I don't know if you can hear the voice, but it's not relevant. Can you hear it? Can you see it?
Not yet, no.
No, okay, so probably it's because it's in another window, not in the program. So I recommend you to show you you click on this when you have the slides. The video shows the opening of a new school year and of a new school, and it shows that there are officials, and I believe there is a secretary of the party present. So this state control is there. Then we have in the 60s the development of infrastructure, physical infrastructure of schools. And then in this 2 minutes film, half of it is devoted to physical education. And the kids, I think they get engaged in 5 or 6 different disciplines. including ski jumping at the end. So that's the approach to physical education and schooling in a nutshell, basically. And then there was a series of reforms to the education system after a Stalinism period, and there was still the goal of building the Soviet man and sustaining this communist values. But there was a change, and stronger approach, a stronger emphasis was put on the physical and intellectual effort combined, and preparing peoples for further work during their life. It's said that it was not very well prepared, but it resulted in a substantial increase in secondary and tertiary education, and we have research confirming that. And it prepared key workers for future communist economies, indeed. So such solutions like adding a year of education to vocational training, this is a real difference, right? And it was executed throughout the Soviet Union. So these are actual differences that happened in the 80s. And this gives the opportunity to exploit what is the effect of the change in education, because it gives us this exogenous shock to the factor that it's relevant to us. And here is a graph where I summarize the main changes in Eastern and Western Europe in compulsory schooling. In some countries, the compulsory age of starting schooling was increased, in others it was reduced. But here is the most important section, where you see that on average, in the previous century, the compulsory schooling was lengthened. And it does some countries where it's negative, but it is mainly removing the not executed rules of compulsory education from the 1920s, let's say. Or in the 80s and 90s, there was some reduction in compulsory education because people wanted to enter labor market earlier. But in general, if you look at the previous century, you see an increase in the compulsory schooling of at least 1 year. And it happened not only in Western, but also in Eastern Europe. So these differential exposures and the changes in compulsory education, they provide the opportunity to examine the causal effects of Soviet communism and Soviet education in later life. And now I would like to show you some of the empirical results, starting from the basic, really simple ones, and then showing a little bit more advanced analysis. So these are the results from the share data. For those who are not familiar with the survey, I say it's a representative survey of adults aged 50 plus in Europe, and quite a large subgroup of countries exposed to communism is now available in share. And if you look at the grip strength, which is a general measure of physical health, and it is not reported, obviously, it is measured with actual dynamometer. So you see that there is no difference between East and West of Europe, and the education gradient is there, and it's the same. We see that those who have more education are slightly stronger and healthier than those with less education. However, when we look at the self-reported health, we see differences in the East and West. And it's not surprising that the self-reported health is worse in the Eastern European countries. So having seen this, it might seem that it's just, you know, the matter of subjective perspective. But if we look at other measures, it confirms that the maps, it confirms the observations that we had from the first maps that I showed you. So again, we have the better quality of life in general in the West, and depression is more frequent among Eastern Europeans than Western Europeans. Here, the role of education seems to be similar. So the slopes of these curves are almost the same in the East, in the West. But if we look at the functional status, it becomes evident that despite in the East, people are in worse functional status. They are more limited in performing daily living activities, and they have more mobility limitations. We find that the protecting effect of education is stronger in the East than in the West because of the slope of the curves. We see that the gradient in Eastern Europe is stronger. So this this is quite a consistent picture showing that if we look at the number of measures of health, objective and subjective, in general, this gradient is there. It's stronger for Eastern Europe, and it confirms that health in Eastern Europe is worse. I wanted to look at the behavioral risks, and I found something unintuitive. So if you look at the prevalence of individuals age 50 plus currently smoking, first of all, the education gradient is not that evident. And even in the West, it seems that those who are higher educated, they are more likely to smoke. Not surprisingly, again, the prevalence of smoking is higher in Eastern Europe. And surprisingly, looking at alcohol consumption, we have hardly any difference between East and West. So this picture that seemed quite consistent looking at the health measure is not so clear looking at the behavioral risks and also pro-health behaviors. Here is the percentage, sorry, not the percentage, but the intensity of engaging in some mediocre physical activity. And this is the Western Europe. And it confirms that Westerners are more physically active, so they seem to take more care of their physical fitness. But if you look at the engagement in any physical activity, Eastern Europe is slightly above, and this difference is statistically significant. So, so it's not clear. And the literature in Western European countries and also in the US finds very strong evidence showing that the gradient is not only with respect to health outcomes, but also with respect to pro-health behaviors. And that's something that we don't find in shared data. So we came up with two main research questions, and we developed them in two papers. One is on the role of communist education per se, but also on additional effects that could come up from the exposure to communism and transition shocks. Now, the first paper is more general. We look at the effect of the politico-economic legacy on the health outcomes and search for answers looking at those shocks that could affect health, and they are especially pronounced in post-communist countries, especially during transformation. And the other paper is on the causal effects of the education on health. So it's a narrower focus, and we wanted to identify here the channel of physical education, but also possibly other ways through which education could affect health. I don't want to spend too much time going into details of the analytical framework here, but we refer to this seminal paper by Grossman and his concept of health production function, where schooling can have direct and indirect effects on health. And it's not clear whether the education affects health or the other way around, but using this a framework of exogenous shocks, we are able to test the causal relations, right? And as I mentioned, the existing research is very much focused on the United States and Western European countries, but not so much on the Central Eastern Europe, and not to mention former Soviet Union. So this is something that we could contribute to, and we could also look at some underlying mechanisms, perhaps with those shocks that we could observe. Okay. There is a unanimity in the literature that the causal effects of education, if there are positive. However, researchers agree that they are very heterogeneous, very context specific and time specific. And despite the large body of literature exploiting the exogenous changes to the compulsory education, there is no unanimity of what's the outcomes. The outcome is often ambiguous. There is a paper by Brunello and co-authors from 2016. That's the only paper I found where the effects, the causal effects of education are assessed, including post-communist countries. They do it with shared data, and they have Czech Republic. So that's the only information we know about causal effects of education, and this analysis is conducted for the whole group of countries, not only for the Czech Republic. So we cannot make the ecological error and assume that the effects are exactly the same. That's only the average for the group of countries, right? So in the following couple of slides, I want to show you the first results we obtained using this approach of exogenous shock due to the changes in compulsory education law. And maybe before I show the results, I will let you know that this is a method quite frequently used, but very often it's not clear whether the reform took place in particular years and what was the change. I've researched the literature, and there are a lot of discrepancies between the articles. So our first step was to clean it up and to find the most reliable data that we could. We did that, and using DGS data, we find that indeed there is a positive effect of compulsory education. So we interpret it as the effect of an additional year of education. As such, it increases self-reported general health and it decreases chronic diseases. We find no significant effect for the disability and for the need for regular personal care. However, when we distinguished between the education under communism and in general, we found quite strong results showing that indeed communist education has positive effect on self-reported health and protective effect against chronic diseases, and is significantly stronger than in other countries. So you see that the interaction here, that this coefficient on the communist compulsory education as compared to compulsory education is significant, and it adds up to these effects. Okay, and interestingly, we also find protective effects of communist compulsory education on disability and on the need for regular personal care. So it seems that, assuming that our identification is fine and properly specified.
Question for you. So what do you think is driving this effect? I mean, what would be the causal mechanisms driving this effect?
So to be honest, I think this comparison in GGS is the difference between post-communist and communist education, not necessarily communist and non-communist education. Because if we look at the share data, we don't find this effect. So if we, but in the share data, we have only the 50 plus population. So I think it is something that happened mainly during transformation and the change within the post-communist countries in the education. And this change, there are a lot of changes, but the access to physical activity facilities is now paid. So kids cannot stay after the classes and just play basketball or football. And there are less, and the curriculum changed a lot. Okay, and so focusing on the education solely, I believe that's the main driver here, the physical education. And using share data, we looked at the behaviors because GGS doesn't have this information. Share allows us to look at the health-related behaviors, but they are strange to interpret and they are not intuitive. And as you remember those stylized facts, it seemed there was no gradient. And here, if you look at the outcomes, we have positive effect of education on alcohol consumption, right? Positive effect on smoking. So this is something we need to really look into in more detail. If we look at the compulsory education under communism, it starts to make more sense here, but in general, it's very difficult to find the consistent and convincing effects for behaviors.
Can we say that communist education was not a consistent, I mean, although we define it consistently with a single variable, it might not necessarily be a consistent thing, so it might have changed over time. So what it meant, communist education, let's say in the 50s, during Stalinism, it might have meant something that is very different from communist education, perhaps in the 70s and 80s, and that might be explaining the results, because in share you have older people, so they are more likely to have been educated under, let's say, Stalinism, right? So that positive effect on alcohol might be what you would expect. Well,
yes.
Well, in the other survey, you find the opposite effect, which is consistent with what you find in, let's say, Western countries, right?
Yes, I think that's one way to interpret it, and the curriculum content could be a candidate for explaining this. So, so after having done this whole exercise, we realized that in addition to education, there's still effect on the regime itself, separate from education. So it's not just the education that could explain the effects on health. There is still strong effect coming from the whole regime. And that's why we looked at the in this other paper on the effects of shocks and on the regime transformation. And it seems that the story is really complex. So it's not just education, but other institutions as well. So it's a very complex problem that we are facing here, and we are disentangling now other possible channels through which it happened. So just to show you that there is a lot of further research ahead of us. And yeah, we have some ideas, but we are very open to suggestions, and I hope you could ask some questions that will open our eyes to those answers we haven't foreseen. And if I were to summarize these presentations, there are definitely negative effects of Soviet communist regime on health, but the effects of communist education are mainly positives, and they seem to be more pronounced than non-communist education. So in general, the Soviet communism was negative for health, but the Soviet education was positive.
Thank you so much. Great. So now we'll just open up for questions. So any question, just unmute yourself. Whilst we wait, let me just add some points of my own. I mean, one of the issues that we know that are important when it comes to communism, I mean, probably today, is the role of informal payments. So the fact that there's still like a significant out-of-pocket, and you mentioned it in the presentation, component in the financing of healthcare, and this could explain the inequalities in the effect of education. And I would have thought that perhaps that coefficient of the effect of a regime, as well as the coefficient of the effect of compulsory education, might well differ by socioeconomic background. So it could well be that individuals that are at the top of the hierarchy might not be might exhibit different effects, let's say, from those at the bottom, because those might be able to afford medical care. And so there might be like a complex interaction there between the education system and the health system, right? So the education system probably affects more, let's say, the public health component of health, right? Whilst the health system affects more the health care component of health, right? So, so a question for you would be the role of informal payments, maybe interacting with education, and another point would be basically perhaps understanding a bit better what compulsory education meant, for instance, in rural areas as opposed to urban areas, perhaps in a place like Poland. I mean, like, would the quality of education differ across the country? You would expect in cities quality of education being better, and that would add an extra form of heterogeneity there that perhaps it would be worth exploring.
Mm-hmm. Can I just follow up on what you just said? So sort of back on the informal payments part, it's quite clear that there is quite a lot of corruption in the welfare states and the healthcare system, especially of these countries. And there is a well-documented body of evidence pointing to a relationship between corruption and people's sort of propensity to follow public health measures, or, to even trust the healthcare system and seek care, which can obviously have an effect on all of these indicators that you have. So are you accounting for that in any way? Because, there's obviously a lot of individual level things here, but there's also some systemic factors that should be taken into account, I believe. And also one thing that I didn't really understand from the presentation, there was a variable which was talking about, it was post-communist, I believe it was named. And sort of again, to follow up on the previous comment that John had made, do you account for the heterogeneity of the post-communist region in the 90s and after that? Some of the places were an active war zone for quite a while, and others had a much more stable transition. So how do you account for that? Thank you.
So maybe I answer to the latter questions first. We control for this heterogeneity between countries in the number of ways. We use country fixed effects, time trends, and country specific time trends. So that's our technical approach to that. However, with respect to the with controlling of the health care system, we have actually paid not enough attention to that, because there might be something that is more general, and we cannot properly capture it with those country-specific time trends. As you said, this corruption, those effects are relevant. And thank you for your point on the propensity to trust and follow health guidance and advice, because we know very well that in those countries the trust in public and private sector is different, and in general the trust is lower, but the trust in public and official is lower than in free markets. So that's an interesting comment, and thank you for that. And answering Joan yours comment on the quality of education, that's true, and we know very well that it was strongly ideologized during Stalinism, and it was different education than after that. So that might be also why we find those unintuitive effects in the shared sample for the 50+ population. Yeah.
I guess another potential driver could be the availability of extracurricular activities. So it could be that, again, in urban areas, there's more extracurricular, or the other way around. I mean, I don't really know which way it would go, but it could be that there might be heterogeneity in availability of extracurricular activities that might have some connection to health, because they might promote physical activity, and that could explain the effect, right? And they might, they might impact on the way kids eat as well, on the way whether they produce and harvest food, that kind of thing.
Yeah, that's true, and especially in those older cohorts where the the infrastructure, the schools, the physical buildings were much different in cities than in rural areas. Rural areas are worse off, with all the respect, and also with the qualification of teachers and how the classes were organized in rural areas. Pupils were often in classes with merged over cohorts. So that might be quite might give strong effect, and maybe incorporating them in the analysis could be still the parameter we're looking for.
And another idea I had is that it could be that schools were places where people would get vaccinated. So it could be that over time, with the introduction of different vaccines, it could be that different cohorts happen to be vaccinated, and that could explain these differences across cohorts as well. It could be that schools were just instruments to then vaccinate children.
Yeah, that's a good point. This could be also the effect of dental care, when it was available at schools for free and easily. And we know that dental care is relevant also for other pro-health behaviors and health outcomes.